He was lead economist at the World Bank's research department and is now professor of economics at the City University of New York Graduate Center at CUNY, that is, a leading authority on the measurement and explanation of trends in economic inequality. Branko, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas. Thanks to everybody for coming. I know that today is a Saturday, so I'm quite impressed that you are all here willing to spend your time learning. Obviously, I've seen a very impressive list of speakers and topics that you have. So I will talk about global inequality, and I think actually, Thomas, I should talk for about like 40 minutes, I guess, and then we should have a discussion and Q&A. Does this seem reasonable?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. I would also need to share screen because I have lots of slides. So
yeah,
if you
we
can
will
please...
make you won't have as many as your predecessor. He had 300 or something.
No, I will not have 100.
I know. So I make you co-host, and then you can share with the green button at the bottom middle of your screen.
Yes, I'm actually... Okay, I think, yes, I'm actually now able. I think you can see them now, I hope.
Yep. Put it in presentation mode.
Put it in the presentation, yes. It's
even better, yeah.
Yeah, let me just do that. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so once again, thank you for coming. It is going to be a fairly empirical, session, but I would also highlight some of the political or economic things. We can discuss them maybe more fully in the Q&A part, but empirical things often do have political economic interpretation, even if we stay originally mostly about talking about numbers. So I would actually, as the title says, I will talk about history or geopolitics of global inequality over the last 200 years. That sounds extremely ambitious, because I will very briefly mention that obviously our data going back to the early 19th century are not really comparable to what we have today. So quite a lot of that is based on the assumptions. I'm using here Fernand Braudel's nice quote from his Civilization and Capitalism, where he mentioned that inequality is the result of structural realities. But these structural realities are at once slow to take place and slow to fade away. In other words, the structural realities are really sort of sticky. They don't change quickly, and that is also true for inequality. I would define the three periods of sort of movements in global inequality, basically depending on the way that inequality actually evolved. So let me first explain. This is sort of maybe somewhat complicated graph. Let me explain what it means. Now, on the horizontal axis, obviously, you have years. On the vertical axis, you have the Gini coefficient, which is the measure of inequality. That measure of inequality, you can obviously make calculate inequality in a city, in a country, in the world. Technically, it's all the same, although obviously getting the inequality for the world is more challenging in terms of, data. But the Gini coefficient runs from the theoretical value of 0, when everybody would have the same income, to an equally theoretical value of 100, where one person or one household would have the entire income of the unit that you're studying. In this particular case, it's the world. So we start with 1820, where I'm actually using a somewhat updated data, but the original data were done by François Morisson and Christian Morisson and François Bourguignon. They did that in the early 2000s. And they, in order to calculate inequality in the 19th century, you essentially have to have GDP per capita of the countries in the world. And clearly, that's one problem. We don't have really the GDP per capita for all the countries in the world. And the number of countries in the world has been different than compared to today. It was much smaller than today. And then they have also estimated very roughly, but there were some estimates of inequality within for groups of countries. Clearly, you cannot have really the 19th century inequalities that would go like every decade or every 5 years for many countries. You do not have data for, let's suppose, Brazil every 5 years, or South Africa every 5 years, or Ethiopia every 5 years. So they had to make quite a lot of adjustments. And one of the projects that I'm involved now is to improve significantly the underlying income distribution data in the 19th century. But I will not talk about that. I will take their numbers as they are. Now, if you look at the graph, if you look at this blue line, that comes essentially from their paper, updated with the new estimates of GDP per capita for all the countries that are in the sample. And what you see there, you see that essentially global inequality was at the level of a Gini of 50 in 1820. We're talking just after the Napoleonic Wars. That level is pretty high level for individual countries. For example, countries like Colombia or Brazil have Gini of about 50. But as this graph implies, that level is not very huge for the world, because the world, not surprisingly, is more unequal than any individual country. Even South Africa, which is probably now one of the most, well, could be most unequal country in the world, is less unequal than the world as a whole. Now, you notice there that inequality then keeps on increasing more or less without stop until the World War I. What is behind that increase in inequality, I'll show you in a minute in the next slide, but I can tell you already now, is the rising divergence in mean incomes between the rich countries, the countries essentially of Europe, Northwestern Europe, the United States, and later Japan, that have become richer throughout the 19th century. On the other hand, two very large countries, India and China, have been stagnant, or in the case of China, even had a slight decline of about 10% in terms of GDP. So this is what economic historians call the Great Divergence. So when you apply the Great Divergence to a Gini coefficient for the world, not surprisingly, you find a significant increase in inequality. All this inequality is calculated in principle, I forgot to mention that, in so-called purchasing power parity dollars. These are the dollars that in principle should provide the same ability to buy goods and services throughout the world. So they should really reflect actual welfare regardless of where you are. We will talk more about that because there are some arguments. Actually, somebody wrote in a comment on my paper, wrote, why don't we use market exchange rates? I will talk about that a little bit later, but let's stay with PPPs for a while. So then you notice the second period, or the second era, where the global inequality is very high, but rather stable. We are talking of the second part of the 20th century. You see the global inequality reaching almost 70 Gini points. And then you see the third era, which essentially is covered by these red dots. Now, the red dots are based now on household survey data. So the red dots clearly have much more information, because there we have household surveys from more than 100 countries in each particular year. And we have percentiles for each of countries and microdata for them. So really behind each of these dots, we are talking about probably like sometimes maybe, it depends actually how you count it, but certainly several hundred thousand people, several hundred thousand observations of household incomes. So it's entirely different database, much richer database. But as you can see, if you look at the point where the blue line and the red line come together, the blue line doesn't seem to be doing such a bad job. So it basically, the red line, however, the blue line, however rough it was done, actually comes up with about the same total inequality in 1985. But the red dot starts in 1980. Now, why is it that the third era, why is it so different? Because essentially the opposite of what we have just seen for the first era happens in the third. what happens is that China in particular, but also other Asian countries and India among others, and Indonesia and Vietnam and Thailand are now catching up with the rich world. Of course, they're still not there, but they are less poor compared to the rich countries than they used to be in 1980 or in 1988 or 1990. So that means in turn that global inequality is then being pushed down. As you can see, we have a decline of about 10 Gini points, which is not at all a trivial decrease. Now, in all of that, you can say, okay, so I told you about what happens to inequality, just talking about essentially mean incomes of the countries. Well, but that's not the full story, as we know. There is mean incomes on one hand, and there is on the other hand inequality within countries. Now, without going into all these details for this graph essentially reproduces the first graph, but now it breaks each inequality measure. And in this case, I'm using tail measure rather than Gini because tail is exactly decomposable. I will not go into the technical details, but ignore it for a minute. This is also a measure of inequality like a Gini, but has in this particular case the advantage that you can break it into the part of inequality which is due to inequality in mean country incomes, and the part of inequality which is due to a summation of inequalities within each country. Just to make it sort of very clear, the blue bar says to you how much of total global inequality is due to the fact that people in Mexico, on average, are poorer than people in the US, that people in Morocco, on average, are poorer than people in France, then people, for example, in Nigeria are poorer than people in the UK, and so forth. So it actually looks at the mean against the mean, but uses population weights. I mean, the other way to see what the blue bar is that would be the total global inequality if everybody had the mean income, sorry, the mean income of his or her country. So in other words, if inequality within countries were zero, the global inequality would be determined only by inequality between countries, and that would be the blue bar. Now, notice one thing about this blue bar. That's very sort of important part. The blue bar is very small in 1820. And the blue bar is very small because the gaps in mean income between countries that would later become rich, the advanced capitalist countries, and countries that later would become part of the third world, the differences in 1820 were small. They existed, but you know, there are many arguments now saying, for example, that difference between more developed parts of Europe and more developed parts of China by 70-50 was quite small, and consequently the blue bar itself was small. Thomas, you had a question. I can see it here.
Sorry, no, I was just trying to find out how people can raise their hand to tell them in the chat.
Okay, very good. If I see somebody raising their hand, I would of course stop, and we can definitely some questions during the presentation. So don't feel shy. You know, if there is a question which I might answer later, I will tell you that, but there may be some question that was really necessary for understanding what I'm talking. So please do feel free to ask. So you see that actually that blue bar was really very small, meaning essentially, as I said, that the gaps between incomes, mean incomes between the countries were relatively limited. If we had the data, and that's maybe one of my dreams, to go back to the 1750, or if we had to go to 1500, the blue part would be even smaller. And that's, I think, important to realize for political reasons, economic history, and so on. The 19th century saw that great divergence, as you can see it now, with the blue bar really rising very much, meaning that suddenly gaps between the countries became so large. In other words, a gap between an average Englishman and an average person in India just doubled, tripled, quadrupled. So that has, and I will not go into that, but it has obvious political, economic, military meanings. In other words, it is hard to imagine that colonization and Western dominance of the world would have existed if the mean incomes were the same. Because with the mean incomes being the same, technological development would be probably similar. There would be probably no difference in the military power, or they would be very small. But if you look at, for example, at what happened in, I suppose, you take 1840 and Opium Wars in China, you see a huge difference in the military power. But that difference in the military power comes from the difference in technological development and the level of income. So that is reflected in the really rising blue bar throughout the 19th century, the Great Divergence. On the other hand, you can also see that in the 19th century, you have the rising importance also of the orange bar, which means that inequalities within countries, on average, also tended to increase. So we have in 19th century very interesting development that we have on one hand the Great Divergence and the dominance of the West globally, but on the other hand, it is the time of class struggles, if you will, because the gaps within these countries, within the UK, within the United States, within France, the gaps themselves, within Germany, actually after the unification and before the unification, the gaps increase between different social classes. So we have then two factors pushing global inequality up: the Great Divergence and class differentiation or greater inequality within countries. Now, things, as I've said before, come to something which looks kind of stagnant at very high level of inequality. You see that for the second part of the 20th century, you have basically then the division of the world in the three worlds: the first world of capitalist countries, the second world of poor or socialist countries, and the third world, known as in those days as the third world of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And that, of course, explains this now very high blue bar, very high inequality which exists between the countries. The orange bar starts shrinking somewhat because you had communist revolutions that reduced inequality within countries. And also you had the welfare state in the West that also significantly reduced inequality. So that was the second period or second era. Now look at the third era. So what I've said before, now it should be obvious that we would expect the blue bar to go down because China, India, Indonesia, and so forth are now catching up, or at least converging to the incomes of the rich countries. But in this third period, we have still an increase of the orange bar. In other words, as we all know, inequalities in all these countries, China, for example, in particular, for China, the Gini went up from something like 28, 29 to more than 40 today, so during the reform period. The Gini went up in the US, in the UK, in Sweden, practically in all rich countries. It went up also in India. So in that third era, you have the following situation. You have the convergence, which leads to the blue line of being, not blue line, but blue bar, I'm sorry, shrinking. And on the other hand, you have the orange bar now becoming larger. So you have two processes that really kind of work against each other. You have the convergence at the global level, and you have widening income inequalities within countries, which of course add to global inequality. Now, the power of the convergence is stronger than the power of rising inequality within nations, and that's why we have overall decline. But what I wanted to highlight is that you look at the three periods, three eras there, and they have not only differences in the total, they have differences in the mechanics or the reasons which drive them. As I said, in the first period, you have both factors of divergence plus inequality within nations going up. But in the third period, inequality within nations goes up, but inequality between the nations is decreasing. Yes, Skylab.
Yes, I am just curious to know why that, a nation like China, and why that within China there would be inequality increasing. Is it because it was trying to be more capitalist in the recent times, or there are other reasons for that?
No, for China, I can actually give you the entire different lecture. next time. But I've studied China quite a lot over the last 10, 15 years. The reason essentially for China is that, well, China became much more capitalistic and market-based. Any part of Chinese income inequality went up. Gaps between the rural and urban area increased tremendously as the urban areas, and particularly the provinces which are coastal provinces, became richer. As they became richer and the hinterland did not increase at the same rate, then the gaps increased quite a lot. The gaps in wage rates went up. China has actually had increased capitalization, which means that more and more people have capital income, but that capital income is extremely heavily concentrated. So there is no aspect in Chinese development in the last 40 years where you do not see an increase in inequality. However you break that inequality, geographically, or by provinces, or urban, rural, or workers versus professional managerial class, you have the increase in inequality, or within labor, which works in the private sector, which is now becoming much larger than the state-owned sector. So I thought actually that there is no division that you can make where you would not find an increase in inequality in China. Does this satisfy you? I mean, does it make sense?
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So there is no, as I said, there is no doubt that inequality in China went up by leaps and bounds and is currently higher than inequality in the US. By the way, inequality in India also went up for similar reasons, but probably, well, almost certainly not as much as Chinese. I will skip that because it's basically the same story, but using something, different data from national accounts. So this is essentially the story of the 200 years. Now, what is the story of the past 30 years? There, the major story, and you will see how that would be then reflected on individual incomes. The major story is the rise of Asia. The rise of Asia is something that we observe when we look at national accounts. Now, the well-known fact is here on the slide, on the left upper slide, where you see total GDP of of China and the United States expressed in PPP dollars as a share of world GDP. In 2015, China overtook the United States. China is now producing about 23% of the global GDP. US is producing 16%. Okay, so that's quite well known that the sort of overtake took place in around 2015. But look at the other pairs of the Asian and European countries. And I intentionally put countries that were actually sort of colonial powers versus countries that were colonized. And look, which is less well known, at what happened between India and the UK. In the case of UK and India, the total output which they produced in 1980 was about the same, and it was about 3% of the global output. Well, now India is producing 9% of the global output, and the UK is producing 2%. So we have had a major transformation, a major change in the distribution of economic power, and the Pacific region and Indian Ocean region have now become much richer than they used to be, and to some extent the gravity of the economic activity is moving towards Asia. So why do I say that? Because you can often start with countries and what happened to the countries and why some countries became richer and others did not. But that's also reflected on individual incomes. So if China has become now the biggest economy in the world in PPP terms, people who live in China have also become richer than they used to be. Now, they are still not at the level of the US. I'll show you that in a minute. Actually, they are less than a half of the US on per capita basis, but their position has improved significantly. So that also meant that as poorer countries and poorer people grew faster, particularly those who are in the middle of the global income distribution, the shape of the global income distribution changed. This is like the distribution where it's actually 100, the population is adjusted for. So in 1988, I look at the distribution of the people in the world, although they are at that time probably about 5 billion, and now they are more than 8 billion. And what you notice is that you now have an increasing percentage of people who are around the global media. Now, this is not what you might call from the Western point of view middle class, because these incomes, as you can see here, are between $3,000 and $10,000 per year per person. So they are modest incomes from the Western point of view, but they are incomes, as you can see here, which are on the average or median world incomes. And you notice that there are many more people there now, that there is greater thickness there compared to the situation in 1988, where most of the people were much more to the left among the poorer parts of the curve. You also see that the curve has moved to the right. What is the movement to the right? What does it mean? It means that actually people are getting better off. So if the curve keeps on shifting and moving to the right, it simply means that incomes are going up. Moreover, incomes are now not only going up in the same fashion, they're going up by making the median and the people around the median more numerous than they used to be. So it's a major change, a major transformation in the global distribution. If I gave you this talk about 3 days later, I would have here 2023, because I was missing African data for quite a few countries, and it makes no sense to give the data without significant African representation. But now I just got them, the World Bank got them, and they gave it to me, and I think I would have it in several days. And but I can already tell you that that particular shape remains in 2023. So it is the shape of the bell curve, but with logarithmic scale. So it is called log normal curve, which is very new for the world. It's very common for countries to have log normal shape, but not for the world. Now, we can, of course, say, okay, is this all true? And say, well, we might want to measure these things different. I will not go into all these sort of individual ways of doing it. I just want to say that the way that I'm doing it is, and most people do it, is to compare welfares of people by using a relative measure of inequality, which is the relative Gini, and using PPP exchange rates, which, as I said before, adjust for the price level between the countries. In other words, $1 that you receive in India is not the same thing as $1 that you receive in Norway. Simply $1 in India would buy you probably 4 times as much, and we have the data for that, for the price levels, would buy you 3 or 4 times as much as in Norway. Consequently, you have to adjust and thereby increase incomes in countries which have lower price level than the US, which is used as the numeraire. But you can also do the Gini by using US exchange rates. Somebody raised this question, and even when you use exchange rates, you do find a decline in inequality, but smaller decline, and you find the overall level of inequality to be about 10 points higher. So let me say these things very clearly. If you use market exchange rates, you will find a Gini which is about 10 Gini points higher than with PPP, simply because you are not boosting up incomes of the people in poor countries anymore. You're just taking their incomes at the market exchange rate, and inequality becomes wider. The decline of global inequality still happens, but it's more moderate. I think it started, I don't know, remember exact number, it started with the Gini of 80 and then went down, I think, to the Gini of 72. So there is still 8 points decline, but with PPPs, the decline is more like 10 points. And as I said before, the level is lower. The level of inequality is lower when you use PPP rather than market exchange rates. You can also do absolute measures of inequality, but very few people do it. And there are reasons why they, in my opinion, don't make much sense, but I will skip that. What I want to show in this kind of story, I want to show some individual countries and give you an idea how the distribution looks like, not only at the global level, but at the individual country level. So what is here in this graph, I contrast urban China and the US. So what you see here, the red lines are the medians. Obviously, the US is much richer countries. It's actually the ratio between the US median in PPP and China median is 3 to 1, 3.2 to 1. Very large gap. It is probably now less in 2023, but we are probably talking still about the gap of approximately 3 to 1. But you also notice that the Chinese distribution is now overlapping significantly with the US distribution. So in other words, the people with lower income levels in the US are being overtaken by people in China. And you also notice that this red line is actually exceeding the US median. So there is significant now number of Chinese who have an income that is above the US median income. There are also significant number of Americans with income below the Chinese median income. That's the blue part of the graph, the blue part of the line, which is below the Chinese median. So we have really the two distributions that in 1988 did not overlap at all. We have some parts of their distributions that now overlap. So this is a major change that we have seen. You know, China is obviously the the most dramatic example of that. But as I said before, quite a few other countries still do, other countries in Asia. However, some people say, okay, let's get China out of the picture because we know that China is big and China has grown very fast and China is the main contributor to the reduction in global inequality. So let's look at the core versus periphery. Now the situation is a little bit different. You know, the ratio between the median of the core countries is basically, I take West European countries and Japan and South Korea. And then periphery is everybody else except for China. There you have the situation that the gap is very large. As you can see, 8 to 1. So we have to sort of relativize this sort of improvement in global income inequality, reduction in Gini, and so forth, by looking at different parts of the world and noticing those that have converged and those who actually converge very little, or in some cases did not converge at all. In particular, I have in mind Africa. So here you have exactly the same graph again, but now in market exchange rates. Now the gap here between the core and the periphery is really sort of astonishing, 22 to 1. So we are talking about the fact that the core countries have a median income which expressed in dollars at the market exchange rates is 22 times higher than the median income of the periphery, which excludes China. So the ratio is kind of mind-boggling. Imagine that for each dollar that you get, somebody else gets $22. It's a huge difference. The point being that we should not be, you know, sort of should not go into the self-congratulation mode, but just saying, okay, global inequality went down by 10 Gini points, where we have large increases in differences in income, or huge, or the existence of big differences between different parts of the world. So that's also even more dramatic for Africa, where actually, as you can read here, less than 1% of African population has an income which is above the median income in core countries. So in other words, what it shows is that very few people in Africa have an income which is comparable to incomes in the rich countries. And also very few people from rich countries have an income which is comparable to the incomes of people in Africa. So the two parts of the world almost do not overlap in terms of incomes. So this is a big statement, actually saying that Africa, with practically 1 billion people, is really not at all overlapping in terms of income with the rich world. And I will come to that at the end of the talk. Now, what we also know, or what happened during this period, was the so-called elephant chart that I've presented many times, so I'm a little bit tired of it. So I will go very quickly. What the elephant chart and the next one that will come in a minute show is the following. They show on the horizontal axis your percentile of global income distribution, and on the vertical axis how much in percentage terms your income at that point has increased. There are 3 points that are worthwhile paying attention to: the A, B, and C. Points A and C have seen between 1988 and 2008, which you can consider like the high globalization. They have actually displayed or shown very high rates of growth. Now, that's particularly important for the point C, because if you are very rich and on top of that you have a very high rate of growth, then obviously absolute distances between you and everybody else would increase tremendously. The point B is the one that created lots of trouble, and this is actually people at lower parts of income distributions of the rich countries. As you can see there, they actually had very low growth, which basically was under 1% per year per capita. And that created a political issue, which of course became now quite obvious. The political issue being whether if you want to increase the position or the rate of growth of people who are at point B, should you do something about globalization so that the Chinese and Indians and others grow a little bit less, so that the point A goes down and point B goes up? Or should you, on the contrary, do policies within your own nation state so that point C goes down, so you redistribute from the rich in order to help the middle class, so that the point B would improve? So, this is a kind of a political decision, and I think this is the decision that is very obvious that when we discuss politics today, whether in the United States or in Europe, if you are concerned, or if the governments are concerned about the lack of growth of their domestic middle classes, they essentially have two options. One option is to try to change globalization the way that it is done, in the hope that actually somehow globalization would favor rich countries more than China. Or the other possibility is to let globalization proceed as it had proceeded, but to focus on internal redistribution between the rich and the middle class and the poor. So that was the political dilemma. Now, this graph then afterwards, in the next period after the financial crisis, changes somewhat. Doesn't really show any improvement for the Western middle classes. As you still see, these are very low rates of growth. But it is interesting that the top of the global income distribution doesn't grow anymore after the financial crisis at the rates at which it grew before. That can change now, possibly, because the top of the global income distribution is heavily represented by the top of the American income distribution. So if inequality in the US now increases, then clearly the top of the global income distribution would also grow faster. But we don't have the numbers for that yet. It's just way too early. And at the same time, as you can see in the graph, the global median, where Asian countries are, has continued growing fast. Now, notice one more thing. This graph becomes more difficult to interpret because as Asian countries develop and grow fast, the population at the median is no longer composed only of Asians. They actually now move into the positions of 70th and 80th and 90th percentile. So the interpretation becomes more nuanced and more difficult because the composition of the underlying percentiles there is now different compared to the past. So what, what has then happened? So this is the summary. We have had kind of two periods. The first one of the high globalization, where you have the elephant chart, which I've already explained, with high growth in the middle and high growth at the top. And then we had a second period until the COVID crisis, where actually the growth rate was sort of high at the bottom and low at the top. And the interesting part, like why was it high at the bottom, becomes very complicated, but I will just summarize it by saying that it is the result of the fact that China has eradicated rural poverty, which means that people have gone over the threshold of $2, $2.15 per capita, and consequently, most of the rural Chinese have left, if you will, have evacuated the bottom of the global income distribution, and those who were above the rural Chinese have now fallen behind. So this increase of income among the very poor is somewhat, how should I say, it is true, but it's somewhat also, it needs interpretation. It is not the same people who were poor in 2008 and who were poor in 2018. There was a remarkable change in who used to be at the bottom of the global income distribution in 2008, and then to 2018 and 2023. Now we have at the bottom much more people from subcontinent, from India, Bangladesh, and from large African countries. And that was not the case in 2008, where a significant percentage of them were from rural China. So China really has had an impact on different parts of the global income distribution quite significantly. But of course, absolute, what I was saying, absolute increases in income were always pro-rich, and that's not a surprise, because pro-rich, I mean, rich people have much higher income. So if rich people grow at 1% and poor people who have an income which is 1/10 of the rich people income grow at 9%, still the gap in absolute amounts between the rich and the poor would increase. So we do have, in absolute terms, we do have, of course, an increase in inequality and greater gains made by the rich. Now, I already talked about the change in the income distribution at the bottom. Let me just say something about the change in the income distribution in the middle, and then I will conclude, and then we can go to the Q&A. Now, what happened in the middle is quite interesting, because we are witnessing what they call the greatest reshuffle of income positions since the Industrial Revolution. What is happening is that many people from the Asian countries, again, the Chinese in particular, are entering into the higher parts of the global income distribution and displacing people mostly from Western countries and from Western countries' lower parts of the distribution who were there before. So just to give you an example, this is the favorite one, my favorite one. It is what happened to China and what happened to Italy. If you look at the urban China and you look at the Chinese urban deciles that are on a horizontal axis, and then look at what is their global income position, it's kind of obvious that they would have increased their global income position, because the income growth of China has been much higher than income growth of the world. So if you look, for example, at the highest Chinese urban decile, it used it to be around 70th global percentile, well, but it's now at the 97th global percentile. So, the shift of the line from blue to red is kind of obvious, and nobody is surprised by that. But if Chinese people sort of go up and displace, get ahead of somebody in terms of income, and we are talking about ordinal scale here, well, somebody has to go down. And now consider what happens to Italy. Italy is a very interesting example. The country did not grow in like 25 years. And what happened is that even if income inequality in Italy was the same, what happened is that the poorer deciles in Italy went down in their global income position. Notice that the red line here for the poor Italian deciles is significantly below the blue line. In other words, the position of a lower middle class Italian, global position that he had in 1988 was much more favorable than the global position that he had in 2018. So in 1988, his global position was 75th percentile. So only 25% of the world were ahead of him. Well, that position in only 30 years later declined to the 55th percentile. So practically half of the world is now ahead of him in terms of income, level of income. So this is a major reshuffle, and I will not go into the other slides, which actually basically show the same story for many countries. But the effect, of course, varies depending on the countries. For example, in a country like Brazil, the China effect is not seen at the bottom nor at the top. It's not seen on the bottom because the Brazilian lowest deciles were really among the poorest in the world, and they remain there. And Brazilian richest deciles are among the richer in the world, and they are not affected by China. But the middle of Brazilian income distribution was, and actually it went down in global rankings. So I think that I would stop there just by simply sort of wrapping it up with the top of the income distribution, because I've talked first about the bottom, where there was this big change with China evacuating all the poor people from the rural China, sort of jumping ahead, with the middle where there was this huge reshuffling of incomes. And then I will conclude with the top, where we don't see that much of a change, because the top 5% remains very heavily dominated by the Western, by rich countries, basically, not Western only, but rich countries, because we have really here also Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore. So we have very strong percentage of their population being there. But obviously the US, because it is much larger than the other countries, and it's more unequal, and it's richer, is dominant in that global either 1% or global 5%. Here is, like, as you can see, the US citizens represent 40% of the people who are in the global 5%. So when we come and look at the global 1% or 2%, the role of the United States is absolutely crucial. And this is where we actually have to look whether global income inequality at the top will become more sort of pronounced or not. We have to look at really what is happening at the top of US income distribution. So let me stop there. There are many other slides and many other issues, but I think I've talked a lot already, and I'm sure you would have questions or comments or disagreements or whatever. So let me stop here.
Okay, super. Many thanks, Branko. And do we have questions in the room? Any hand signals or messages in the chat?
Yes.
Joseph?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Thank you so much, Iranko. Kindly, why is it that the global agenda only comes either from the West or Asia? And we, as your brothers and sisters from Africa, we have resources that we work together. Look at the mines, look at the forest, look at the structure of the rocks. We work together. But when it comes to global geopolitics, or the agenda of the economic geopolitics, it only comes from the West or the East.
Okay,
what is the gap?
Let me answer this. This is not here about the agenda or non-agenda. It's about simply what has happened empirically in the last 30 years. Now, what has happened with Africa, and actually it's a good question because I didn't come to that, but I want to show you this. What has happened with Africa is that Africa has not been a success. In other words, let me just show Africa. Africa had very few cases of countries that had, you see here, I listed them, that had 5 years of, 5 successive years of growth rates of 5% per capita. In other words, if you are talking about this need for some kind of a catch-up, one cannot have a growth rate of 10% one year and then minus 10% another year. It's not going to lead anywhere. And then here I listed the African countries that since 1960 had the periods, the episodes of growth, which were significant, as I said before, 5% per year for 5 years. Now, look at these countries. Only Ethiopia had it for a significant number of years, 13 years, and then only Ethiopia had a large population, because it matters also if you have large population or not. You know, for global inequality, growth rate of a country of 500,000 people really makes absolutely no difference, or even 5 million people makes no difference. But Ethiopia does. And that's the only country that actually for these 13 years, and that was recovering from the civil war and famine and secession, had this sort of significant growth. But then when you compare that with the Asian countries, here is the same table for the Asian countries. Now, many of them are way bigger than Africa. I mean, obviously, than African countries, obviously China and India. But you notice how many episodes are there in Asia. So it's not that the Asia is setting the agenda. We are talking about global inequality, and Asia has transformed global inequality. Africa, on the contrary, has really fallen behind. And you will notice also here that other than Ethiopia, there is no other large country. There is no Tanzania, there is no Congo, there is no Sudan, there is no Egypt, there is no Nigeria, there is no South Africa. So essentially, and that's a very good question that you asked me. It's not a question of the agenda. It's the question we have to really use the words as they are. Africa has not been able to converge in any sense. And actually, it has become relatively poor. So we do have an issue, and Africa will set the agenda in the future for two reasons. Maybe it would actually start converging. That's one possibility. And the second, it's the only continent with rising population. So African weight in the global income distribution would become higher, simply because that's the continent which grows, whereas all the other continents are either stagnant or on the decline in terms of population.
Matt?
Yes, hello. I do have, or maybe several areas of disagreement. One is quite a small one, which is that the chart of which is labelled global income distribution, I think, isn't that more accurately labelled distribution of people at levels of income? Because I think the risk with that is that it might distract from the actual global income distribution, which would have a huge a sort of exponential curve up to the right. And the other issues are, I think that if you call income distribution inequality, then aside from using, if you use GDP, then you could ask, well, what about money the government uses on military, say, and does that benefit people? But generally, I think the concept of inequality would have to assume something about needs. And the other thing is that it's to do with real income. I know this is a very, it's a common thing for people to talk about real income. But I mean, the fact is that inflation is subjective. And how do we compare, how do we count the fall in the rise of electronic goods and compare that with changes in the price of bread? So I think that real income, I'm questioning that because it's subjective.
Okay, there are several questions here about the global income distribution. There is nothing new there. I mean, these are distribution curves, actually. They are in statistics, you can label them any way you want, but they are distribution curves. There could be distribution, there in this particular case, people distributed by their income level on per capita basis, but there could be distribution curve of anything, the earthquakes, floods, or temperature, size of cities. It's always a distribution curve. Now, on the second, that becomes more difficult. First of all, these are not GDPs here in what I've shown you, except in the 19th century where we don't have survey data. This is actually real income of individuals that are being surveyed. Now, what is real income? Real income is the local currency income converted in those PPP terms. Now, it is true, and that's the issue, whether the use of one PPP, which means one price level for the entire country, really makes sense. In other words, we actually use for China, India, Indonesia, two different PPPs for the rural, one for the urban area. But it could be argued, and actually Thomas knows that he and Reddy have argued that 20 years ago. It could be argued that actually we should use different CPIs in reality, or different PPPs for different parts of the distribution, because it is true that the distribution, that the consumption pattern of poor people is not the same as the consumption pattern of the middle class, and the middle class not of the rich people. So that, I think, it's quite a valid. It's difficult to implement. There was something which was done at the World Bank, which used to be called PPPPP. There was the 4 Ps. The first one is standing for the poor. But I think it's a legitimate question that I think it's a legitimate question for each individual country as well, because if there is an increase in relative prices of what you might call the wage goods, or essential things like housing, health, and education, it's clearly different than if there is an increase in prices for luxury goods. So yeah, I take this point. I think it's not easy to implement it, because it would require really PPPs to be diversified, not only between the countries as we have now, but between social groups within countries. And that's not easy. However, I think it technically could be feasible in I don't know, maybe in the future, 5-10 years.
Well, I think we also have a problem about that over time.
A problem of what? I'm sorry?
Over time.
Well, as countries develop, then the same people will be buying different things, and you have a similar problem.
No, I agree with that. Actually, that's the issue, is what is the appropriate, PPP is like as an indicator of it's an index of prices. So each price index has problems, because the price indices, of course, use the weights, which are total consumption weights. For the PPP, the weights are actually global consumption weights as well. But global consumption weights depend on the way of consumption by the rich people, because obviously rich people consume much more than poor people. So this is an intrinsic problem to the price index.
But my point is whether we use the word real.
Well, we use real. I mean, the term real, we use it simply by wanting to say that we are using nominal local currency, and then we convert that using a price index into something which then, by that definition, becomes real.
So there not being another question right now, let me ask you something about the drivers of inequality. And inequality obviously is heavily influenced by the way we structure our economy, both at the national level and also at the global level. And how we do structure it is subject to political contestation. So different people have different interests, and they try to influence how the national economy and the global economy are structured. And the influence that they can exert, you can say, is roughly proportional to their wealth, to their economic position. Richer people have better ways of influencing the media, influencing politicians, and so on and so forth, both on the national level and on the global level. And in that regard, I suppose it's the Forex exchange rate that matters. So when the question is who can influence decision makers in Nigeria or in the Congo or in Bangladesh, can foreign governments and foreign multinationals exert an influence? The answer is that depends on how much money they have available in terms of Forex. And so the same would be true for international structures where you have G20 meetings or OECD or the United Nations or whatever, again, it would seem to be that the Forex inequality matters. So I'm wondering whether you can expand a little bit on that and also give us a view about how you would explain the developments that you found and how you would extrapolate them into the future in terms of the present distribution of political influence and the contestation over the structuring of national and global economic structures.
You know, on that one, I would agree, of course, that Forex is a better indicator, actually, how rich you are in terms of currency at a market exchange rate is a better indicator of your political power than is PPP, because PPP is an indicator of welfare, but not of power, because you can have very high, let's suppose, high welfare in Bangladesh, but if you want to influence somebody in England, you would need to influence that, or even in Bangladesh, you would have to influence somebody with real dollars, and you may not have that many real dollars. So that's true. Now, I've been pushed a little bit in that direction, including doing all this. You can do all of this that I've shown you here. You can do it also in Forex. And I mentioned that actually the Gini is then higher by 10 points, that there was a decline in inequality, but it's actually somewhat slower, more moderate decline in inequality than using PPPs. The curves are similar. I actually cannot say that I remember how the curves were for the middle year, but 2008. But 2018 is similar to this one in the sense that it is actually looking more symmetrical. Not quite symmetrical, because the right-hand tail in Forex is much wider, longer than in PPP. When you use PPPs, it is not as long. So yes, I think everything can be done in foreign exchange, and as I said, it makes sense actually. So I showed actually here, for example, that graph which compared Africa and I think the core countries versus periphery in Forex. Now, about the future is what is actually interesting here. I want to point out one fact, and that fact is that as of now, China is no longer a contributor to reduction in global inequality. And I want to say this very clearly. China is now sufficiently rich that its median has passed the global median. So more and more Chinese people are the 60th, 70th, 80th, and even 90+ percentile of global income distribution. So if China, let's suppose, grows faster than the world, if China grows at 5%, as it is growing now, 4.5 or 5, the world grows at 3%. So China's position further improves, and China becomes closer to the rich world, but becomes further away from many large countries in Africa, or even countries that are in Asia, but they don't grow at the rate of China. So this graph shows you that basically, without explaining what is there, everything which is below zero shows that in those years, Chinese growth has reduced global inequality. And notice what happens in 2022. For the first time since 1978, we have this small positive number there. And that small positive number shows you that China now is a slight contributor to global inequality. So high growth of China is no longer an inequality reducing growth. It's an inequality increasing growth. It's still not very significant because China is just above the median, but it will become more important. The implication of that is that if we really think of global inequality and what would the forces that would reduce global inequality in the 21st century, Africa comes to the fore for the reasons that I just explained before, because it is quite poor, relatively poor to the rest of the world, and is the continent with increasing population, and that by itself starts playing a much bigger role, because here the unit of observation is an individual. So if you have more people in one part of the world, that part of the world just becomes more important, simply arithmetically. And secondly, also countries like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan start playing a big role. So if we really want to have a reduction of global inequality, not stop or continue, we really have to focus on growth in large African countries. I highlight large because Africa has 55 countries, but small countries obviously do not matter for global income distribution the way that large countries in Africa matter. And there are about 7 or 8 that are actually around more than 100 million people. So that's where I think the international, how should I say, the attention, international community, or whatever you want to call it, should be really focused.
Okay, and still Africa is important. How well Africa will grow and eradicate poverty in Africa is important, but that is driven again by whether Africa finds favorable rules at the global level. The world economy is structured in a way that allows Africa to grow at high rates, and also how these African countries are structured, who gains the upper hand there in the political fights. And so my question really is one about how inequality feeds upon itself. It could be that inequality is self-reinforcing in a way, in that once the rich become too rich, then they are able to dominate the structuring of the national and global economy and make it possible for that inequality to be entrenched and maybe further exacerbated. Whereas once inequality is sort of relatively moderate, it stabilizes at that lower level. So that I'm talking about path dependence here, and about the possibility of perhaps multiple equilibria, where you can have a high equilibrium that might even lead to ever increasing inequality, and a lower inequality equilibrium that is self-stabilizing at a reasonable, tolerable level of inequality.
This is all fine, but what I'm actually speaking here is it's not, there is no, how should I say, causal analysis what makes Africa not grow. It is simply the observation that Africa has not grown, that has been left behind, and that having been left behind has or will have in this century significant impact on what happens to global inequality. In other words, we have become maybe somewhat blasé by saying that China will essentially drive the world and reduce global inequality, reduce global poverty, and that's no longer the case, simply because China has become sufficiently rich. So it is simply that the emphasis has to shift both in terms of poverty alleviation and in terms of global inequality towards the countries that are poor and populous. And so that's essentially the role. That's where Africa comes to play a role.
Yeah, and you're not willing to say a bit about what you think the causal drivers are that will influence the development of inequality forward going, right?
You mean in Africa?
Well, Africa and the world at large. You are basically what you're saying is Africa will be important because of rising population growth, and because that is where most of the poor people live these days. And much about the future of inequality will depend on what happens in Africa, granted. But then the big question is, so what will drive that, right? Are we living in a period where inequality has reached a level where it is very hard to reverse because the people at the top are so powerful economically and politically that they can prevent an erosion of their position?
But Thomas, that could be true for individual countries, but we have not reached, the fact is that in the last 30 years, we have had significant decrease in global inequality. So that's the fact. Now, the way to continue doing that is to make Africa grow. So the question then becomes, what would be the ways in which large African countries, I've listed 7 or 8 of them, how will they grow? I think that's the main issue. Now, if one says, okay, they cannot grow because they have such sort of inbuilt inequality in those countries, that growth is incompatible with the level of inequality that exists in South Africa, for example. Yes, I really can take this point. South Africa has enormous inequality, has higher inequality now than before the end of the apartheid, and I can take this point that inequality within nation states in Africa is an impediment to growth of Africa, and consequently, it is an impediment to the reduction of global inequality. So that would be my sort of logical chain, from high inequality in South Africa to that being bad for South African growth, to that being bad for the global inequality and global poverty reduction.
Should be seen in the context of Africa being poor and it being relatively resource rich, which means that very rich multinationals and governments abroad have both the incentive and the means to corrupt African governments, to come in there to exploit the resources. And African governments, whoever is in government, they are between two constituencies. On the one hand, they're being influenced by the local population who are relatively poor, and they're being influenced by these super rich foreign multinationals that are very, very interested in the African resources. So again, this is my question to Branko. You know, are we at a level of inequality? And I'm not here talking about the Gini so much as I'm talking about the inequality between the top people, top 1% of the world's population, let's say the super rich on the one hand, and in particular, the African populations, right? They are so rich that they can dominate politics within most African countries, and that they can heavily influence the global economic structures in such a way that they can entrench their position and keep Africa poor, or rather continue exploiting Africa at, for their benefit and at Africa's expense.
Yeah. Well, that's what I said before. I think actually, if one has the view of the world where very high inequality in African countries makes the elite entrenched, and that entrenched elite does not have an interest or cannot stimulate or increase the rate of growth of that economy, African economies will continue not to grow, and that now has a significant implication for the global inequality, because Africa, in terms of population, is increasing and it's not converging. So it is true that in that kind of a logic, the entrenched elites in different African countries now do not have an impact only to what is happening in that country. They do have an impact to what is happening in the world, which obviously, if the countries were smaller, because again, I'm speaking of population size here, if the countries were smaller, would not have an impact globally. But as the countries are large and becoming larger, it does have an impact global. So I do think that this century is going to be a century where we'll have Africa play either a positive or negative role, but in a much bigger way than it did before.
Okay, any questions from our seminar members? They were the ones that especially were supposed to prepare for the session. Is Ibrahim here with us? He wrote the prep paper.
Yeah, I read the paper. It was quite well done. So it is actually, I'm quite grateful to Ibrahim for having.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to be here though.
Or maybe he read everything he said. Well, that's it. Nothing new.
I don't know, or he was confused about the time. That also. Any questions from seminar members, including Christian, if he is still here? Okay, then we go to Carol. I think you had something in the chat. Carol, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I will. Can you hear me? Just
Yes,
I'm
we can
hear you
going to
well.
turn on also my camera so you can see me. Yes, it was just a comment based also on Joseph's question, because there's also this interesting book from Professor Derkon on gambling on development, why some countries win and others lose, with a very interesting perspective. I thought it was also a good example for him. There's not only policies or laws that are, of course, very important, but there is also the role of elites, that they can decide and they can also change a lot how the country can move forward. So for him, for the author, for the professor, it's also a matter of a development bargain, where a country's elite shift from protecting their own positions to gambling on a growth-based future. And there's also a list of countries, because he analyzed different countries and he proposed also some good examples. So that was my comment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To the risk of sort of repeating myself, but I really want to sort of somehow make this very clear. When we talk, I think, about global poverty reduction and global inequality reduction, our state of mind has to change compared to it was maybe 20 years ago. And it has to change because of the success of China, which can be also a way to, could be a way to, how should I say, replicate. So that's one issue, actually. Do we see features in Chinese development that are replicable? And it is the fact that historically, the countries, the nations that have been growing the most and at given periods of time tended to be either replicated by others. Take Japan, replicating Germany and France in the Meiji era, or they themselves tended to, how should I say, impose their own way of development on others. So I think we should think in the future coming years of China possibly playing that role. And secondly, what I already said before, of Africa having simply by the weight, the importance of its population, playing a key role actually in this century. And that was not the role that it played until now, because it didn't have the population of the size that it will have, relatively speaking, in this century. I think that there was actually another question. Somebody raised my hand, so I just
Skylab.
Skylab
is next.
I have just a small query. I'm just curious to know if you have used, colonialism or imperialism as kind of explanatory, remarks for understanding the inequalities across the world. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Well, I mean, when I showed that first slide, I said that quite clearly, that you cannot sort of see the increase in global inequality in the 19th century and not think what it means. Now, the causality can go both ways. Was it the Industrial Revolution that just happened by itself and then the West became much more dominant and expanded? Or was it that the two effects happened at the same time? Or was it actually that the colonialism started first and then the countries became rich? But I'm not sort of going to solve that question for you. But I do think that whoever sees that slide and sees that great divergence immediately has to think that the great divergence in incomes that is shown on the slide means great divergence in technological development, which means great divergence in military development, which means the ability to conquer the rest of the world. I think it's kind of pretty straightforward. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, maybe imperialism also you might have, discussed and then.
Yeah, but as I said, it's actually the link between what we see in terms of global income inequality in the 19th century and political developments globally. I think it's pretty clear. But as I do believe actually that the two processes went together. So in other words, I don't think that there was industrial revolution and then conquest. Nor do I think it was conquest and then industrial revolution. I think actually that the two were simultaneous, but that's an opinion.
No, I was just thinking about the present context and how imperialism or neo-imperialism could be, meaningful in understanding the inequality, global inequality.
Well, it could be meaningful in the sense that if one doesn't have these numbers, then one talks about global imperialism in abstract. But with these numbers, it is not an abstract. Actually, if you look at that slide with blue bar, the blue bar was so small in 1820, because the gaps between countries were very small. As I was saying before, actually, I would like to see that bar in 1750, or in actually 1500. And that bar would be even smaller. So the gaps between mean incomes in those days, if you take actually pre-conquest Mexico, it was poor, but Europe was poor as well. And China was poor, in India. So the gaps between these countries, this average income in those places were very similar. We are talking about subsistence. I've done actually economic history and done empirical work. We're talking about countries that are at the subsistence or at maximum 3 times the subsistence. So these were the differences. And then the 19th century is an entirely different story. We actually have countries that go like to 20, 30 times the subsistence, and others stay at the level of S, subsistence. So that's where the difference comes from.
Okay, we have to wind up.
Yes.
Branko, this was a very rich and interesting session. So thank you very, very much for joining us.